Hello everybody, my name's Nicola. I used to be a futurologist. Voted most pretentious job title of 2007 in Computer Weekly magazine. Very proud, one of my proudest moments, I have to say. So as Paul said, yes, I'm no longer a futurologist. I should have seen that one coming. The jokes are endless. I'm now slightly more boringly titled Head of Customer Insight and Futures in BT's Global Innovation Team, which means I'm pretty much still a futurologist. And of course, all my marketing colleagues still call me one because they find it entertaining. But obviously it does, everyone always asks where my crystal ball is, and I always say I have one. Doesn't work, unfortunately, so I do have to work slightly harder for my living than reading tea leaves and looking at crystal balls. And I always say I don't really need a crystal ball because actually working for a lovely company like BT, I'm surrounded by a lot of quite interesting people. I'm actually based at Adastral Park, also fondly known as Martlesham. So I am part of the team there. I am surrounded by a lot of very intelligent people doing some quite incredible things with technology, and I'm usually fairly mystified by it all because I'm not a technologist, I'm actually a psychologist. So my role is to try and understand, well, us basically, and how customers are changing and how their demands are changing on organisations that are desperately trying to serve them. So a lot of my research, and frankly I'm an academic, so I don't use the crystal ball that often, mainly because it's, there's an outage, international outage on crystal balls. I actually do a lot of research, basically asking the market, asking consumers, trying to figure out where we're going, what's changing in terms of our demands as customers, because frankly we are doing some pretty weird stuff at the moment as consumers, mainly because some of the technology has changed. So it's basically trying to force an industry that's probably very risk averse actually in the contact center industry. I have worked with contact centers for nearly 25 years. Obviously, I started when I was 6. I keep saying that the one interesting thing about the industry, I used to joke that the only thing that used to change with contact centres were the carpets. And frankly, we need to change way more than the carpets. Unfortunately, most contact centres are changing in the face of enormous disruption. And actually, that's the reason why I got brought into the innovation team recently, because I think one of the things that we've recognised, certainly in terms of innovation, is it's not necessarily just the technology that's the big disruptor. It's us. It's the customer. It's our behaviours that are actually disrupting the market. So we need to start to think very differently in the contact centre industry because our customers are starting to think and behave very differently. So what I'm going to do today is talk you through one of the pieces of research that we've done. It's actually one that we did last year. It is called Super Agent 2020, because frankly, in the face of some of this rather weird customer behaviour, the fundamental question we asked was, do our agents need their underpants on over their trousers? Do they need X-ray vision? Do they need all these superpowers? And well, it's an interesting question to ask because they are being faced by ever more complex demands from customers. So this particular piece of research we did, if any of you were at Call Centre Expo, actually it was nearly 2 years ago now that we did the original piece at Call Centre Expo, so we jumped on people randomly. I was on the BT stand and we managed to get lots of people to fill in questionnaires. So that was one aspect of the research, but we did also work with the Call Centre Managers Association in the UK, in the US, well their equivalent in the US, and also in Ireland to try and actually gauge where the industry thinks it's going. Now traditionally a lot of the research I do is on consumers themselves. And actually, if you keep watching this space, in 2 weeks' time, we're about to launch our new autonomous customer research, which is taking the temperature of consumers and really asking them how they want to interact with organisations. I'll weave in maybe one or two of the things, give you a little bit of a preview there. But traditionally, we've looked very much at the consumer market. Actually, this piece of research knowingly looked at the contact centre itself and actually looked at where the industry thought it was going. Now, there are some biases in this research because a lot of the people that answered these questionnaires, frankly, were call centre managers, operations managers. So I will mention the bias as we go along because there are one or two things I can see why they've said what they've said. It's easier for managers, certainly. But let's just think ourselves forward. What are we going to be doing in 2020? are we going to exist at all in the contact centre industry is quite an interesting and challenging question, which I'll leave till the end, frankly, but because it could get rather depressing. So, super agents. Let's just click there. Whoop. Marvellous, right. So originally I've been in research for a very long time, as Paul suggested. I remember working back in the 90s with Paul on a project called Foggy Windows, which was all about dimmer switches on Windows so you could see through and pull information through. And actually, as part of this big research program that we used to run back in the 1990s, I had the pleasure of doing visions for the contact centre, actually originally of 2000. And this was back in 1995. And this is actually the visions. These are the visions that we originally came up with. So anyone's contact centre 15 years on look like this? Yeah, we were a tiny bit ambitious, although actually I do think that a lot of the things that we came up with in 1995, when we again asked the industry where they thought the contact centre was going, actually still do apply today. So if we look at some of these visions of the contact centre of 2000, so projecting forward exactly 5 years, the same as we're doing in this research, we can see all sorts of stuff that is kind of coming true. So things like the ability to choose where we work. Technology is untethering us. So the ability to actually have a contact centre that isn't necessarily lines of desks all plugged in, all tethered by wires, so they can't necessarily wander around or choose where they work. I think that certainly is one aspect of the contact centre that we need to consider. More on that in a minute. We've got things like using all sorts of surfaces as knowledge environments, because this is a knowledge industry. Increasingly, we're being asked lots of complex questions across multiple channels. So do we just need to project everything onto a tiny little screen, or can we start to use all sorts of surfaces for knowledge? Well, that one's maybe a little bit further away. But certainly, I keep saying there's something down here that looks like an iPad. I can't claim that we invented the iPad, by the way. Having said that, interesting fact you may not know, the tilty thing on the iPad that makes the screen move, actually that's a BT patent. So they bought that Apple bought that from us for a few pence a while back. So we do have some element of the iPad, but we didn't actually invent it. But the idea behind that was very much around, well, could managers start to become a lot more mobile within the contact centre? So actually literally managing by walking around rather than again being tethered in their office looking at their MIS stats. We've got video into the contact centre, again something that's starting to come in now. And we're about to do a piece of research this year on how video can be used in the contact centre space. So all of these things, frankly, they're not that far away. It's just they didn't actually happen in the year 2000. And actually, the only contact centre I have found to date that even remotely looks like this is the Airbnb one, which is a remarkable contact centre. And again, a contact centre that is doing not necessarily just phone-based work. A lot of the Airbnb contact is through things like web chat and digital channels rather than necessarily the phone, but they are giving their agents the choice as to where they work, and they are providing them with interesting connected environments in order to do their work in. So we need to change more than the carpets, for sure. We may not be quite this radical, even in 2020. We're starting to see some of these things come in, and certainly one of my roles in BT in the innovation team is to start to create this stuff. So we don't just imagine it, we just don't just do the PowerPoint. We certainly try and create it, work with startups, put a whole load of stuff at our Adastral showcases, and actually show people around and show it working and say, is this where you want to go? Because we think this might be quite cool and actually also might enhance the customer experience. But we're not going to go that far today. We're going to get a little bit more maybe mundane, some people would say. Let's pull it back a tiny bit and do a reality check with the industry. So actually, all the jumping on people at Call Centre Expo and all the asking questions of the Call Centre Managers Association were a little bit more mundane than this. It wasn't necessarily about visioning the environment and the technology. It was asking 7 fundamental questions about the contact centre industry and getting, hopefully, some very well-informed answers as to where it might be going. Now, frankly, the first obvious question to ask is, by the year 2020, which is, by the way, not that far away, what's the contact centre actually going to be doing? So that's kind of a fundamental question. So we asked that one. certainly the answer was quite interesting. So we're already starting to see the contact centre move very slightly into a different space. One of the reasons is obviously, and our research is called the autonomous customer on the consumer side, there's a clue in the title. We're doing a lot more ourselves. We literally are packing our own groceries. In fact, we're working really hard, often as customers, to do stuff ourselves, with the idea that nobody would then call, of course. So let's get rid of the contact centre. That hasn't happened. What has happened, interestingly enough, and it certainly has, I work with a lot of large global corporates in BT, and typically the banks, for example. What we're typically seeing is less traffic coming into their contact centres, but call handle times going up by 30–40%. This is indicative of what also this research is telling us. The contact centre, by the time we've tried to serve ourselves, tried to do something ourselves, actually we're still reaching out. We still want the human contact. We want to be able to ask questions, not of just lovely people, but people that can actually tell us answers. So this complexity is very much starting to hit the contact centre across multiple channels as well. So the phone being one of the primary ones, but we're also seeing contact across the board starting to get much, much more complex. So we're getting this complex problem-solving trend, according to 54% of our survey. They think that complex problem-solving is going to be the absolute principal thing that the contact centre is going to be dealing with. Now, there is certainly still about just under a quarter of people saying that they think that there's still going to be quite a lot of the routine, transactional, inbound type stuff that we've always dealt with in the contact centre industry. There's a couple of things. Well, firstly, not all customers want to serve themselves. Some of them can't. They don't have access to the technology. So there is still an element of that coming into the contact centre. Complaints are an interesting one. Now, we did split complaints out in the questionnaire. It's kind of a specific example of complex problem solving, but I would say actually complaints is in the realm of it's quite difficult to automate a complaint. By their nature, they're a little bit incendiary. So actually, that kind of thing certainly is in the realm of the contact centre. I actually think the most interesting one, based on some of the other research that we're doing, is the proactive piece. So at the moment, the contact centre tends to be almost the victim of consumer demand. So it responds to that demand rather than necessarily actually controlling that demand. And I think a lot of the technologies that we're starting to see come in, like big data, for example, Internet of Things, all of those potential streams of information could be used more proactively with the contact centre, so the contact centre starts to become a little bit more in charge of its demand rather than necessarily just responding passively to it. Now that creates a slightly different model for the contact centre, more on that slightly later. So we've got complexity coming in. We can evidence that as well, working across the piece in contact centres, certainly in BT's own contact centres. We see a lot more complexity coming in, as I said, in certain industries is very, very obvious. So complexity coming in. Fantastic. That's what we want, frankly, because the machines are going to take over. With anything you can flowchart, AI will start to take over as we go into the future, and not that. It's going to be the next couple of years that we're going to see really intelligent AI start to take out some of that inbound transactional routine stuff. What you can't do with AI is a lot of the really complex stuff, the stuff that requires empathy, care, intuition, creativity. All of those things are quite difficult for machines to do. So we've got complexity coming in. We've got the rise of the robots. Do we truly need agents with underpants on over their trousers? We might need a very different agent. So typically what we find is frequently still in the contact centre industry, we still employ often very young, often relatively inexperienced. We often still script them. We certainly we don't train them a lot because still we've got a churn and attrition problem. So do you put that kind of person in front of people that are asking complex and emotive questions is one question. Who do we need in front of these customers? Well, frankly, the skill sets, we asked about the skill sets that were required. You don't need people with underpants on over their trousers. You do need people with some really, really quite specialist skills. Even now, I've always said that I could never do their job. It's a difficult job. Even trying, I always say, there's a lot of cognitive load. Psychologists like the word cognitive load. My brain has to work very hard when I'm doing any contact. Actually, particularly phone can be quite difficult. You're listening, you're trying to interpret what the customer is saying, you're trying to reinterpret it into the language of the organization, you're trying to navigate 12 different databases, trying to remember how to operate those different databases and have an intelligent conversation. Really difficult to do for a start. So we do almost need superpowers, but not quite. What skills do we need? That was the question we asked. So again, the industry told us it was, to be honest, a lot of this is not rocket science. The key skill for super agents as we go into 2020 is the ability to communicate. Wow. Now, across different channels as well. So there is a subtlety to this. They may well be in an omni-channel future communicating over multiple channels, but they need to be good communicators as the primary skill. However, there are two interesting ones that came up behind that. One is certainly the knowledge, the expertise that people have about these products and services. They have to know more than the FAQs. They have to have a certain amount of expertise. And certainly in BT, we've been talking about this notion of networked expertise for a while. So how do we actually network people that know stuff with the customer that's asking complex stuff? So the product and service expertise, the knowledge has to be there. But there's more subtle than that. They need to be able to understand the product and services sufficiently to communicate simply to customers about them. And frankly, most products and services are not getting easier. Certainly if we look in the telecom space, the finance space, telecoms products, financial service products are not getting easier. If anything, they're getting a lot more complex. So how do we get our agents, our advisors, to actually explain these things in terms that customers understand, and possibly only in 140 characters if we're dealing with social media? So they need great communication skills, good expertise, but they also need the ability, I call it the ability to stick the fork into the complex processes, the spaghetti behind all of those processes that we have in organizations in order to solve complex problems for customers. That is a very different skill, typically, to the let's take a transaction and pass it on type skill that often our contact center model kind of implies. I've always said the mission of the contact center almost is let's take lots and lots of contacts really, really fast. So rather than necessarily solve these things. So actually, in an extreme, if we're getting a lot of big complexity coming into our contact center, regardless of the channel, these agents need to be able to take that complexity on and actually almost project manage on the behalf of the customer the complexity into the organization. So those analytical problem-solving skills are increasingly important for our agents. Now, I have to say empathy and resilience are also very important. They might not have been ranked so highly, but we did ask quite a lot of quite challenging questions around skills, and I think it was kind of, well, what should we rank first and what shouldn't we? So you do need to be empathetic because that's human, but you also need to be resilient because often you're not going to get ecstatically happy customers coming through to you all the time. So you do need to be able to deal with anger and frustration very well, and resilience certainly is part of that. So they're the kind of skills we think we're going to need as we go into the future, a complex future for the contact center. The next thing, to be honest, I can bore for Britain on measures. I find measures completely fascinating. As a psychologist, we know that measures drive behaviours. I used to do a lot within BT's contact centres many, many, many years ago when they used to get measured on things like call handling time. Fortunately, a measure that's kind of falling off as a primary measure now because it really doesn't make any difference to customers, within reason anyway. But I remember sitting watching people measured on call handling time hanging up halfway through a conversation because they were being measured on call handling time. And I go, why did you just do that? And they went, well, I went over my 180 seconds. I'm going to get hit. So I've always thought this, because no sane person would do that. They're employed to talk to customers and they hang up. So measures we know drive behaviours. Measures, we often look at the measure rather than the reason for it. So you do get some crazy stuff going on, particularly when you go into transactions. So we asked about measures. Now, this is a really interesting one for me because we can see things like call handling time going way down the pack. And I keep saying for resourcing, it's important. Yes. Hitting agents around the head because their call handling time or their contact handling time is getting higher, not particularly sensible. And obviously the other issue with call handling time is we're in an omni-channel realm again. Where is average call handling time when you're doing chats, when you're doing email, when you're doing the phone? It all gets a bit complicated. So it's too simplistic a measure necessarily, as I said, maybe important for resourcing, not necessarily important for the customer, and certainly not something you should hit agents with around their heads. The good news is that the kind of important measures are the ones that are getting the most focus. And I'm very happy to say that customer satisfaction is the primary one that people think are going to drive their measure sets into the future. That makes a huge amount of sense. What was interesting, however, is that there's a sort of young whippersnapper on the horizon at the moment in the form of customer efforts and easy. And certainly this is something that I did some research on last year with Moira Clark at Henley Business School, because it's very much a drive in BT around easy and effort and how you measure it and things like that. So we're really pleased to see that people are starting to think around how do we make it easier for customers. Now, this isn't simply because it's a good metric for customers. There is a profit aspect to easy and effort as well. And again, our research has shown time and time again for the past 5 years that customers that are working very hard, that are finding things really hard, actually aren't very loyal. So if you find things difficult, you're going to leave. If you find things easier, you're actually less likely to leave. And actually the figure on the most recent research, as I said, going to be published in about 2 weeks' time, is that 88% of customers say they will do business with you again if you make it easy for them. So it's not entirely surprising that easy is the young whippersnapper tapping on the shoulder of customer satisfaction. The other interesting thing is that Net Promoter seems to be going down in people's appreciation. And I think there is another reason for that if we look at it relative to customer effort. In the contact center space, it's very, very hard to move people up one on the Net Promoter score and actually see the impact of a customer service advisor's role on that score. With easy and effort, you can. And again, looking into what BT's been doing with the effort score, we can start to see what drives our effort score. We actually measure something called Net Easy, which is frankly a shameless steal from Net Promoter. We stole Net Promoter, we changed the question, we asked how easy was it to do business with BT today. You rank us either easy or difficult, we earn 1 + 1 if it's easy, -1 if it's difficult. We add it all up. At the end of the day, we come out difficult or easy. We can start to see the impact of the contact center on that score. So it's not surprising that actually almost 70% of the drives around our easy score are about the contact center. So it's getting through to a person who is not just lovely, but can do something for me. Hence the expertise, the skills piece is very, very important in driving an easy score. Actually being able to navigate to that person is pretty important as well. So, and obviously things like doing things right first time, doing things timely, keeping customers informed, all of those things are very, very important. Drive the easy score, but also tangibly for us, it drives our loyalty and retention score very highly. It drives our Net Promoter score, it drives our loyalty and retention score, it really does work. So I think I'm very happy that this is starting to come on the radar as a very, very good measure for contact center.